Welcome everybody. I'm Janet. I've worked with companies using machine learning over the years as an employee, as an advisor, when doing due diligence as part of my work with venture capital firms. And I've been in IT itself for a couple of decades. I've seen testing done really well and also really poorly. And particularly in the last 5 years, I've seen a lot of otherwise really excellent machine learning projects suffer because the people implementing them didn't test properly. And today I want to share some of my best practices. So I work at a company called Napier. We provide compliance solutions in fintech, so anti-money laundering, trade compliance, financial fraud detection, etc. So getting things right is really critical for us. Now, no company wants to be on the wrong side of a news report. And I believe it's the responsibility of every single member of a company to make sure that these headlines don't happen. Good testing is not a nice to have, something to be cut when deadlines loom. It is not just a case of running some static tests through your models, getting 90+% accuracy and then throwing it over the wall to a team to implement. It is absolutely fundamental to the full life cycle of any technical project, and that includes machine learning and data science. And all of these problems that you can see on the slide could have been avoided with good testing. And good testing is a skill that I see lacking in many machine learning departments. The focus is so narrow just on training the models and the hyperparameters that individuals can neglect other best practices. Or more usually, they've never been trained in these practices. Now, testing is a full part of the scientific process. And if you are not testing, don't you dare call yourself a data scientist. You're doing data coercion. So testing is basic hygiene, but that said, I am also a pragmatist. In business, there are times when corners get cut. Most of the time, you won't be starting on a brand new project, and there'll be a lot of code you're picking up that's not in a good way. It is a lot of effort to add good tests. And don't try and fix the world in one go, or it will never get done. Start with what's the most important, the highest risk to your business, and what you can change, and then add to it. I mean, that's pretty much general good life advice. Apply it to your projects as well. There's a great saying that if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And this means do some rather than avoiding it altogether. Like I said, testing is hygiene. I'm sure we've all had days where we've left the house without brushing our hair, or maybe there's that one day where you forget to brush your teeth before bed. It's not a problem as long as you pick it up again the next day. If you leave it too long, you're going to have problems. So what I'm not going to do is give you a very detailed course on how to use PyUnit or bombard you with statistics about optimal code coverage. The former is freely available online, and the latter is as much as possible. I'm also not going to dive into the detailed mathematics of the things you should already be doing to test bias, fairness in your models, and all of this. There are plenty of papers out there. And if you've been to any of my talks before, you'll know I either go heavily technical or I tell you a story. And my goal here is to tell you the story about best practices in a way that will stick and in a way that you'll take them back to your companies and you'll remember them. If you're already doing all of these things, then I absolutely salute you, and I want you to walk away knowing that you are one of very few. Most people are not doing enough testing. So let's go on this journey. This is a hypothetical company, Imaginary Machine Learning Results Limited. And as of 5 minutes before this talk, this was not a legally registered company. So if anyone does happen to register this and complains that I'm saying bad things about them, then I hold no responsibility. So our imaginary company, it's small. It's grown over the past 3 years gently with an app and a website. They've been using an off-the-shelf chatbot and a recommender system to give advice on diet and exercise to their users based on a small number of statistics. So the results are not great, but they want to grow and get some investment. And the feedback from the VC firms they've contacted is if they want a better valuation for their business, they need a better user base and they need their own IP. So they decide to bring the machine learning in-house and hire a small team. The existing developers are absolutely fantastic at websites and APIs, but they don't have the right feel for the data. So let's see what happens on this journey. So the new team take the data and with some Jupyter workbooks come up with some results that suggest that when people are offered different exercise plans, they usually reject the first two, but the third one is the one that seems to work for most users. So to get fast results and impress the CTO, rather than building new models, they just ask the developers to iterate through the API call a few times and take the third one and give that back to the user as almost the first result. The data shows that this should be the right strategy, so they're somewhat confused when complaints start to rise and the recommendations begin to drop. The data was clear, or was it? Now this is a great quote from Cassie Korzakov. You need to remember that your data encapsulates a subset of the world that you're in and look beyond it. And there's a great example from the Second World War. US Air Force were trying to determine where to add extra armour to their planes. And the armour plating was heavy and had an impact on the speed and duration that the bombers could fly. So they only wanted to add it where it would make the biggest difference to the survivability of the planes. So they studied the pattern of the bullet holes in the aircraft and got this pattern. The logical conclusion from this data was that the armour needed to be on the tail, on the edges of the wings, and the very central part of the aircraft. And this is clearly what the data was showing. What they failed to realise until Abraham Wald pointed it out was that planes hit on the engines never made it back home, so their data was missing. While planes hit on the wings and other parts of the fuselage could easily fly back. This is survivorship bias. Your data is a subset and you need to test its limits. So while data doesn't lie, it doesn't offer up information easily, and use it without question at your peril. Now, projects that suffer from this rarely make it to go live because as soon as they start using real data, they just don't work. So lesson number one, remember the bullet holes. So in keeping with the spirit of all sci-fis ever, we have our mirror universe, our alternate reality where the team does something differently. So in this universe, they take that step back and spend more time with the data. They split it into two pots. In one pot, they do some very thorough data analytics, and they save the other pot for doing testing and inference on their hypotheses. They realize the majority of the users who stop on the third exercise plan never return to give further information, positive or negative. And there's a similar plan across the other iterations. And they form some hypotheses. And one of those is that maybe after 3 goes, the users just give up. It's not that it's the best plan, it's just still not good enough. So they split their data and look at models where they get a positive feedback result, where they get a negative feedback result asking for a new plan, and one where they get nothing. And come up with suggestions which they then test on the next part of the data. They're pretty confident that there are situations where these new models will help, but it will only be a slight uplift. They're not trying to go to 100% straight away, and they get ready to roll that out with minor improvements. So that's their first test. The second problem in our first reality. So our main timeline. The team got their act together and they came up with some better models. It took them a bit longer, but they're ready to do their proof of concept. There's a lot to do, and they split on the tasks with a framework based in Docker that the development team had given them. And they each work on their own little bit. And I'm going to assume, for the sake of all our sanity, that this is a group of people that understand collaborative work using source code control, which is a talk I think I gave last year or the year before, which is another skill that a lot of people seem to be missing. But let's assume that this team know all of that and they can do that. So the individual doing the data preparation and transformation routines that we see in the middle, they're all done. The data's been eyeballed. It seems to work. The results that are coming out can be fed into the training model, and then that person goes on holiday. The individual that's working on the inference routines realizes that the data that's coming via the API call is different to the data in their database, and they need to change the data preparation class. The inference code works fine, and they commit their code. But when it comes to the end-to-end test, doing the training and then using that training, the model from that training for inference, things don't work as expected. And they're getting different results from the isolated model, and they don't know why. So moving on to a space example. 2005, European Space Agency, the ESA, launched Cryosat-1, and the picture there is of the rocket launching. And its aim was to study the polar ice caps in detail, but it failed on launch. The second stage of the rocket burned out completely and did not separate, and it caused the rocket to fall harmlessly into the sea north of Greenland. Now, for those of you that don't know, with rockets, they're usually multiple stages, and the first stage is for that initial getting off the ground, second stage to get into higher orbit, and then third stage to actually get into proper orbit. And usually the engine's cut off before the fuel's burnt out completely, in some cases so that they can control where that stage falls, but mainly so that it's not at the final deadline for cutoff. But our investigation for Cryosat-1, it was found that the flight control system was missing the command to cut off the main engine in the second stage, and therefore it burnt out. The next command, which was to do the separation and ignition of the upper stage, never triggered because the step before it didn't run. If the ESA had unit tested the flight control system, they would have discovered this was missing before launch and could have been resolved. So separate your stages with unit tests. So in our mirror universe, the team started converting their models into a proof of concept, and they write unit tests for all of the main classes and all of the interaction points before they really start building it out. And when one of the team realizes that a class needs to be extended, and in doing so, they break some of the data conversion routines for the data input for training, the daily unit tests highlight it immediately, and the team can resolve the feature change without breaking existing, even though they're all working on different aspects and someone's on holiday. If you don't currently unit test, there is a really good guide, and I've put the link on the slide. It's not difficult. It does take effort to put into place, but it will repay you back 1,000-fold, I promise you. So lesson 3. So the front-end team have updated the app and the website so they can gather more details. So in our main timeline, the machine learning team are involved in daily stand-ups with the developers. They're all working remotely, and they have their daily 10 minutes to discuss what everyone's doing. Now, our machine learning team aren't really interested in front-end development. They only care about the ML side. So they give their updates, and then as soon as they've given their updates and listened to each other's, they zone out. They do their emails, they carry on working, and then just zone back in again just to say goodbye and thank you at the end of the meeting. Months roll on, and they start to work on a recommender system for the diet plans to go alongside the exercise. So they use a combination of likes and dislikes of food, the exercise plan the person's on, but also weight and height. And the system works really well in testing on their historical data. Accuracy drops off a little with more recent data, but nothing for them to really be concerned about. So they give this to the dev team who add it in. It fails terribly. They get more subscription cancellations and bad reviews. The feature's disabled, and the team just go back to seeing if they can fix the exercise plan model. So maybe they just didn't have enough data yet. In 1998, NASA launched the Mars Climate Orbiter. And this was a space probe intended to study the Martian atmosphere and act as a relay for surface communications for the rovers that they would be sending a few years later. It had a successful launch in December 98. The mission proceeded as expected for the next 9 months. And in September 99, the spacecraft began orbital insertion. And this is where the speed and direction of the spacecraft are adjusted away from the collision course and into a good orbit. At this point, as the spacecraft passed behind Mars, it was out of contact nearly a minute earlier than expected, which raised concern. And then communication never returned. It was assumed that the craft encountered Mars at too low an altitude, which you can see in the diagram. So as ever, when there's failures at NASA, there is a big investigation, and it was discovered that a piece of contracted software supplied by Lockheed Martin produced results in commonly used US units, pound-for-seconds. This fed that information into a piece of NASA software, the trajectory software, which made calculations using those results, but assumed that they were in units of Newton seconds. And this is the SI unit, and it was specified in the contract. So as a result, all of the thrust calculations were off by a factor of 4.5, and ultimately, as you can see, the craft was not on the correct course. Now, interestingly, even though it was a contractual issue, NASA took full responsibility for the error, as they believed it was their responsibility for testing that everything was right and handling errors. So if you're going to head for Mars, get your units right and check that your data is what you expect. So let's go into our alternate universe. Here, the machine learning team were engaged in the stand-ups. They took interest in what other parts of the business were doing. And they picked up that front-end changes to support both internationalization and also the requirements of some of the UK users, they wanted height and weight both in metric units, but also in imperial units, in pounds and inches. And there would be a new database field to manage these units. So while this was being developed, the team knew they needed to make some changes. They used the existing data and converted it so they had some metric and some imperial to work with. They also checked that the data field was there, it was the correct type, and it wasn't missing. So even though the dev team had assured them that this field would be filled, they added some tests for sanity to check that this existed. And they made a conscious decision that if this field wasn't populated and they couldn't tell whether it was metric or imperial units, they would not try to guess. They would discard that data, but report it so it could be investigated. So in the first few runs, they help the dev team spot the records that had not updated correctly, and they can test their new models in parallel with the front-end tests so that both teams are happy and ready for the release. So in our main timeline, the team are developing on Macs and deploying on Ubuntu. Very, very common. Due to some library vulnerabilities, the CTO of the company mandates a change from a deployment in Ubuntu 16 to Ubuntu 20, from Python 2.7 to 3.8, and upgrades to all of the other dependent libraries. The team do this, they just do a new install, upgrade the requirements, run everything, and are somewhat surprised that the code doesn't work. And the code isn't working in a way that gives them errors in particular libraries, obviously. It just fails halfway through model training. The tensors fill up with nans. They change some of the parameters, and after one exciting day where they think they fixed it, the training fails again overnight and well before it was due to finish. They start rolling back the libraries one by one to see which one might have caused the issue. One of the team starts working their way through all of the change notes for the different versions, but there are so many version skips that there's just too much to go through. Debug prints look fine up to a point, and then it just goes unstable. It's not at a specific time in the training. It doesn't seem to be based on any particular data as far as they can tell. It just blows up. The team are working long hours, getting stressed, and they start grumbling at when they can just roll everything back and go back to their proper jobs. So after a couple of weeks of this, the team lead makes a call to keep the team happy and decides to roll everything back. Ubuntu 16, Python 2.7, all the old libraries. Looks the CTO in the eyes and says they solved the problem. And gets the software ready for release with its vulnerabilities. And after all, old software is not really a problem. Or is it? So 1996, the ESA again. So they launched the cluster spacecraft. And this was an Ariane 501 rocket with a payload of 4 satellites to conduct research into the Earth's magnetosphere. It was a really interesting project where they were going to fly the 4 satellites in a tetrahedral formation to investigate the atmosphere. 37 seconds into its flight, as you've probably guessed from the diagram on the slide, the spacecraft veered off course, began to disintegrate under high aerodynamic forces, and then self-destructed, with the loss equivalent of $370 million. So why did this happen? So the rocket contained an inertial reference system. It's very common. And this senses the position, orientation, and velocity of the craft internally to the rocket and provides feedback to the rest of the systems to adjust thrust and angles. And the IRS used in this rocket was that had also been used in the Ariane 4 rockets. And Ariane 4 had 113 out of 116 successful launches, so it was a very well-tested component and very performant, and everyone at the ESA were comfortable with using it. The Ariane 5 was a bigger, more powerful rocket. It had a much higher initial acceleration, higher velocity. And these velocities increased far more rapidly than that of the Ariane 4. As it was a newer system, the other systems in the Ariane 5 used 64-bit floating point numbers. The IRS, being an older component, used 16-bit signed number, and some of you might be able to see where this is going. There was no protection within the IRS for any buffer overflow. And the combination of these systems had only up until that point been tested in simulation, but they had not tested to the extent that the Ariane 5 would go to under launch. They tested against the parameters of the Ariane 4, but using the Ariane 5 components. So they never picked up this problem. And during launch, the horizontal velocity caused a hardware exception due to this buffer overflow, and the craft just lost all navigation. They did not check the values they could get were what they were expecting and deal with the scenario. And more recently, there's a similar issue has happened with chemistry, and this, you may remember this was announced pretty much this time last year. So there's a Python script from 2014. It's a 1,000-line script created by Willoughby, Jansma and Hoyle, called the Willoughby-Hoyle script. And what it did was it took pairs of Gaussian output files and compared them to look for chemical shifts. And the fact that it used pairs of files was very important. Now, within this 1,000-line script, there was a call out using the glob function in the operating system. And this is implemented ever so slightly differently in different OSs. When they did it, it returned the results in a very particular order, and that was the order they used. They did not test on operating systems they didn't use, and similarly, they've not been testing on each new operating system since. When other people picked up the script, it had a paper explaining it, they assumed it was correct, they used it, they didn't double check the results within it, they just took the results for granted and wrote their own academic papers. It was only when the script got to a lab where researchers were using lots of different versions of operating systems that they noticed they got different results. And this impacted hundreds of academic papers over those 5 years that needed to be rechecked. Now, not many people go to the effort of checking fundamental OS commands, and that is a huge rabbit hole. But you do need to be aware that things you have not written can and do change. And things that you've not written that don't change can also be changed by other things further down the line. If you are reliant on a specific result, you need to make sure you get it, and always make sure you handle exceptions. So, into our mirror universe. The team are aware this is quite a large upgrade of versions, so they add to the unit test to cover the library calls using the original system as a reference, because they know what they should be expecting from some of these mathematical functions. They prioritize some of the bigger changes, spend a few days writing the tests and run them. One of the biggest changes they had was NumPy, where they jumped from 113 to 119. And they noticed one of their tests threw an error when they were checking its value. They were using a function called isSubDtype. And when they passed it saying, is this a float? It returned a false rather than a true, because in 119, a function was deprecated and it needed to be an NP floating type. In that situation, because it was coming back as false, those values were getting zeroed in their code. The huge version jump meant that they hadn't seen the deprecation warnings, so without the testing, they would not have been able to find the fix easily. They managed to update the latest versions and were confident, because they had the metrics, that everything was working as it should. So back in our main universe, the recommender models are live, despite still being on the insecure library versions, but they're leaving that problem for another day. And to be fair, hidden within a container, it's not quite as noticeable as it otherwise might be. The model runs, and the team look at selling some of the peripheral cross-selling ideas that the board have had for other health supplements. And at the same time, they're bringing on board some new dietitians and exercise classes to add to the advice portfolio. Now, some of these new advisors complain they're not getting as much engagement as the platform promised in their contracts. And even if a user initially self-selected their plans, the user was quickly recommended something else. The team weren't aware that this was happening until it was called out. And put on the spot, the team lead estimates 3 months to investigate and build a new model. They have no idea what the cause is or how long it might take, but 3 months is a good rule of thumb. It's long enough to give you time to find something. Gemini 5. Now, this was launched in 1965, right in the middle of the race to the moon. And it was the aim of the Gemini program, Gemini 5 particularly, was to get everything ready for the moon flight before the Apollo program. So Gemini 5 was designed to orbit the Earth for 8 days, which is the amount of flight time to get to the moon from Earth. And it had 2 astronauts, Cooper and Conrad. The latter of which you can see being winched into the rescue helicopter there, called it 8 days in a garbage can due to the tight confines of the spacecraft. From all accounts, it was like being forced to sit in the 2 front seats of a small car for 8 days. There was a very successful launch and orbit, and there was deployment of an evacuation pod, which was successful, would mirror some of the work that was done in Apollo later. There were a lot of engineering issues that all were resolved with shutdowns, restarts, good old turn it off and on again. And after over 120 orbits of Earth, pretty much at the same rate as the ISS is going around now, about once every 90 minutes, they returned to the surface, heading towards their planned landing point in the Atlantic Ocean. They landed 80 miles short of this point, although luckily still in the ocean. And the reason for this was computational drift. Now, the Earth's rotation is not precisely 360 degrees in 24 hours. This is why we need leap seconds and leap days. But this is what had been set in the computer, rather than the exact figure of 360.98 degrees. And over 8 days, that extra fraction adds up. And the computer's calculated location based on mission time had drifted from its actual location due to the rotation of the Earth. So always remember, the planet is moving beneath you. So back in our mirror universe, the team know that the retraining they have in place will cause a skew away from these new plans initially. because there's no positive feedback from them. And it will take a while to gather enough data to get them into the models so they can recommend appropriately. So they work with the dietitians and fitness coaches and create profiles of individuals who should have these recommendations and create a model using some pseudodata. They already have tests for the skew of the model, and as the new plans are loaded into the system, they're added as further tests. So the model made with the pseudodata is tested in parallel with the main model and then rolled out to half the people that match the profiles so they can analyse the feedback. And once there's enough genuine data, they make a new model and include this. The onboarded dietitians and fitness coaches are kept informed and they know they'll see their engagements rise. Everyone's happy and there is gentle increase in positivity. Number 6. So the team link the ongoing training input from the chatbot so they can take the feedback from the users directly and put this into the model. The chatbot is kind of a friendly, engaging device on the app and website that just asks the user how their diet and exercise has been going, have they lost weight, if so, how much, and just encourages them in their exercise. And it's one of the most positive aspects of the company. So the team are using this information just to help update and provide better recommendations. Initially, the app ticks along as always. And after a few weeks, the company sees web traffic and app downloads increase dramatically. And after an initial celebration, usage drops off as dramatically as it started. Over the weekend, one of the developers noticed that their site has appeared on a subreddit as the crappy diet app that suggests you starve, along with a lot of negative comments. The team look at the system as a user and find that regardless of what they enter into the chatbot, it recommends they need to eat a lot less and exercise more. They reset the system back to the original models and turn off this update system. So when a news agency tries the site, they don't get the ridiculous recommendation and the company avoids a massive PR scandal by a whisker. But they're back to very manual, slow, updated models. Launched in 1983, the USS Yorktown was a prototype for the Navy's Smart Ship program, and it was refitted in 96 with 27 dual Pentium Pros, including a Pentium Pro server, all communicating across the ship by fibre. And this ran all the ship's systems and was predicted to have saved about 3 million a year by reducing the crew complement by 10%. In 1997, a crew member sat at the terminal entered a 0 into a database field. This resulted in a divide by 0 error that brought down all of the machines on the network, and this left this battleship dead in the water for nearly 3 hours. An accidental user input that completely debilitated one of the US Navy's flagships. We've also seen some of the things that users do to systems. And particularly when it comes to ML systems, it can bring out the worst in people. Sitting behind a computer, just as you are now, is like a mask. And it can trigger this psychological process known as de-individualization. You can be swept up in mob mentality and lack of consequence through to this anonymization. It can become a game to see how easily you can confuse or break AI. We've seen this with Tabot, we've seen this with visual recognition systems, we've seen this with self-driving cars where individuals spray things on the road to confuse them. We've seen this with autonomous robots being attacked. It's no different from the people that think it's a laugh to do SQL injection attacks into forms. It should be handled, but it's the same mentality. Can I break this? It's not going to cause any harm. And as an aside, if you want to see how powerful this can be, there is a wonderful show by Darren Brown. It's quite a few years old now. It's part of his experiment series on Channel 4, and it's called Remote Control. It's freely available on YouTube, on the link on slide. And he took an audience of normal, everyday people like you and me, and they did awful things to a stranger just through their anonymization. The only way to protect against this is to have an amazing test team who will test the systems like the belligerent, hateful users that we are all capable of being, as well as the accidental and the incompetent users. Testing systems that self-update is harder, and it does need some specialist testing skills. So some items can be picked up with exploratory testing techniques, but if you know that a system is updating based on feedback, you need to do far more. You need more data prep, you need more time, you need constant resets. An alternative route is daily testing of some known results and have alerts triggered and investigated if the results deviate. You need to catch these sorts of changes early before your model deviates too far. So validate your inputs, your outputs, and just like you need to set boundaries for children, determine your normal operating conditions, set some fail-safe escapes. What are the limits you don't want to cross? So deal with your Yorktowns and your masked mobs. So in our positive timeline, when the team build in the dynamic training, they add some tests, obviously, and they keep the updated model separate to the main so they can see the difference between the original model and the one being updated without affecting the live results. And looking at the results of the test, they see the model is skewing towards very low calorie diets and intense exercise. So they take a look at the input data and notice that some of the results from the chatbot for weight loss in the past month are negative. The chatbot has asked the users if they've lost weight, and if they say yes, it asks them how much. And for some people, saying minus 10 pounds is as acceptable an answer as just 10 pounds. So the model considered this a weight gain and was adjusting the recommended plans accordingly. As more people made the same mistake, the model started to skew towards recommending more drastic plans more quickly. They reset the models, update the routines to handle this issue and continue to test. And after seeing some more accidental misinputs correctly handled and the recommender system update correctly, they put this live for a small percentage of the users and do some A/B testing. And once all of the odd inputs are handled, the system works really well and they roll it out to everyone. Because this was never live while it was in error, they didn't get the cascade of deliberate misuse as in the main timeline. So in our main timeline, the models are out there, the system is ticking along. They worked in isolation and found out why the new instructors weren't getting recommendations. They fixed the issue, but with no communication, the instructors cancelled their contracts and went elsewhere. The business failed to get the growth it wanted and are desperately looking to improve the sales of associated products and start pushing these heavily. The ML team start getting bored. They start looking at archive to implement some of the latest ideas. Customer service has noticed that feedback and engagement in the plans is dropping again, but nothing has really changed, has it? So Spirit was one of 2 Mars rovers launched in 2003 by NASA to investigate the Martian surface. So one of the rovers that should have communicated with the orbital satellite. And the rover travelled to Mars without incident. It landed safely in the expected location. Originally, Spirit was to have a 90-day mission, but it lasted over 21 times that, and performed experiments for over 5 years and travelled much further than anyone expected. In May 2009, the rover became stuck in some soft sand and could not be freed. In the attempts to free it over the next few months, 2 of the wheels became completely inoperable and they were no longer able to tilt the solar panels to allow for recharging, and these were slowly being covered with sand. With the drop in solar energy, the rover entered low power mode, and it's suspected it did not last the Martian winter due to it being too cold. Its last communication was in March 2010, and then it lost all power. So monitor your input volume. And if you'd like a more topical example, One of my colleagues in the Royal Statistical Society data science section has written a great blog post on why the data loss in the COVID track and trace is a failure of good data science practice. You should always have some simple measures monitoring incoming data and alert if anything changes. So in our alternate timeline, the team are investigating ways to hyper-personalize the plans using machine learning. When the team lead gets the weekly automated monitoring email, in amongst the training statistics, they see that hardly any user data is being added to the retraining. And while there is natural variation, it is worth checking. The front-end team verified that the logins to the platform were within normal range and the data was being saved. It just wasn't being picked up by the models for training. Jumping on the problem quickly, they watch some data coming in and they spot that there's a format change in the third-party chatbot that means that the data is being rejected for training. So while they didn't have a test for something they could never have predicted, monitoring what they could control helped them isolate that there was an issue and fix it quickly. Your data is critical. You need to make sure that it's coming in, and if it's not coming in, you need to know about it. There are many companies that check all of the data imports so that they can tell when something's going wrong before data's lost. So to summarize the best practices from our mirror universe, think of the bullet holes. Are you being impacted by silent data, survivorship bias, hindsight bias? Separate your stages with unit tests. Where you have interfaces that should communicate in specific ways, add those tests. If you have nowhere else that you can start, try those. It will give you a huge impact. If you're heading for Mars, get your units right. Your data may look right, but really make sure you're in the same units. I've seen this a lot where incoming data is abbreviated and you often get mix-ups between thousands, millions in the same column, and it's not always labeled which one it is. So don't cause a cluster. Never have silent failures. Do not have try except loops where the except is just a continue and it can fail silently. Handle your exceptions non-catastrophically. Always remember the planet is moving beneath you. Change is one of the constants, and you'll need to make sure that your models update as data changes. And deal with your Yorktowns, your mass mobs. Human users are one of the biggest problems that any system and app could have, either through accidental error or intention maliciousness. Humans are unpredictable. Set boundaries so that the behavior can't destroy your hard work. Monitor your input volume. Gather statistics on what's impacting your system. Is there a sudden change in the data incoming? Has inference time suddenly jumped? Observability and monitoring in your ML systems is key to finding problems before they become endemic. And hopefully, if you can remember these 7 lessons from the US Air Force and Navy and the various space agencies, then you'll be in a really good place. And finally, if you'd like to do the right things while fighting financial crime, we are hiring, and we've just been awarded one of the best places to work in the UK. So thank you very much.